Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session on the strategic outlook for Europe. My name's Thorold from the Wall Street Journal. We are at a defining moment for Europe. After years of the EU helping to converge economies and financial systems, that process has, for the time being at least, gone into reverse. The UK has taken the radical decision to leave the EU completely, and even within the EU, we have an increasing divergence in the economic performance between certain countries such as Italy and Germany, who we have represented here today. Instead of sharing the wealth for some, the EU has become a way of sharing the pain. Unacceptably high unemployment exists in certain countries in the south, and we're seeing disaffected voters push back aggressively against mainstream politicians around the bloc. Against this backdrop, we have a fantastic panel to answer the question of how Europe can reinvigorate its economy and create lasting political and economic solutions for the challenges it faces. Just to introduce the panel, Peter Altmaier is Federal Minister of Economic Affairs and Energy of Germany. Beatrice Mauro is President for the Center of Economic Policy Research and co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Europe. Pierre Moscovici is Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, Taxation and Customs, the European Commission, and former French Finance Minister. Giovanni Tria, Minister of Economy and Finance in Italy, and Gillian is CEO of Booking.com of the Netherlands. So will you please welcome the panel? Thank you very much. So this session is very much about the intersection of the economy and politics, but I just wanted to start off on the economy with Beatrice, actually, and just to say it's been a relatively weak recovery since the financial crisis in Europe, and in the last few months we've seen a slowdown of that, particularly in Germany and Italy. Can you give a sense to the audience to start off with? Is this just a blip, or is this the beginning of something more profound for the economy here in Europe?
Well, the recovery actually has been quite strong in certain parts of Europe and has also been very long lasting. So the very strong performance of 2016 and 17, for instance, in Germany, did slow down in 18 and is also going forward now, is being revised downwards. And that's not just a blip, as it doesn't look like it's just related to auto or cyclical factors. But rather, it is, it's in line with the slowdown of external demand. So we have worldwide, IMF is revising downwards every quarter and more or less everywhere. So it's not a particular concern of Europe only. But of course, we always have to put this into the perspective of what is the long-run potential growth rate. So what can our expectations be on the long run? And that one still seems to be around 1.5. Sure. So that's more or less where we are now.
So you don't see this as something more concerning?
It's certainly not dramatic, but the problem is that there are risks. This is not a safe baseline. There are many risks to the downside, and that is what is concerning.
Okay. Giovanni, you're at the sharp end of this in Italy. To what extent, with interest rates already very, very low in negative territory and limited room for maneuver on the fiscal side, I mean, how do you feel about the Italian economy and your ability to react to what is happening?
But the Italian economy substantially follow the European economy and mainly the economy of the major countries like France and Germany, because we have a very strong interdependence of our manufacturing sector. Then this means that the problem for Italy is that we have, since a decade after the big crisis, a lower rate of growth, but always at the same distance from average Europe, 1% below. Then we follow. Then we have some structural problem, but we follow the rate of growth of Europe. Then now, I think that, of course, we have a big impact because the slowdown of Germany, maybe a slowdown in France, and in Europe. In the last year, it's a paradox, but the distance has been reduced. Has been lower between the two rate of growth, but according to the forecast, consensus forecast in 2019, maybe we have the same distance. Of course, we try to do better, increase investment, etc. But we have this problem. We have also some impact on that come from the interest rate that increased in a period after when arrived the new coalition government. The spread increased. I think mainly because there was a kind of uncertainty on what Italy wants to do with Europe. People thought that we were going to a crash, but it's not that this is the intention. And now, after the agreement with the Commission, this means that we respect the fiscal rules. The agreement is also on that. That I think that the spread of interest rates will decrease. Already decreased in Italy, but will decrease more. In the last month, for example, we have a huge demand of our debt.
Absolutely.
Because of course it's yet with a good return, but without.
So again, you would agree with Beatrice.
Yes.
There's a slowdown, but nothing too profound. What are you seeing in terms of the bigger picture globally? You've faced quite a slowdown in the car sector. How are you seeing the impact of the trade conflict between China and the US and the uncertainty around Brexit?
There is still a solid economic growth, and I remember when I served as an acting Minister of Finance, we were congratulating each other for the fact that for the first time in 10 years we had economic growth in all member countries of the European Union. There has been quite a strong and sustainable growth in Germany over almost 10 years. It is now, after 9 years of continuous growth, we are approaching the 10th year of growth, and that would be the longest since 1966. The question is, can it be affected, and how will it be affected? It will certainly be lower than expected originally. This has to do with statistical problems last year, with the shortage of rainfall and water, with the automotive sector in trouble. And it has to do, of course, with the question marks regarding Brexit, regarding US, Chinese, European trade relationship. This had not yet an immediate impact, by the way, in the first place, but it made consumers and investors more cautious. And that's the point we should have in mind. And therefore, we have to prevent, as good as we can, a no-deal Brexit. This is a matter of concern for all of us. It would damage certainly the UK more than any other country in Europe, but it would damage everybody. When I met with Boris Johnson, when he still served as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, I said, Peter, let's make a win-win situation out of this mess. And then my immediate reply was, oh, look, Boris, when you have a couple married for 40 years, 3 children, 2 cars, a house, a cat, and a dog, and they decide to divorce, it's very difficult to imagine a win-win situation, except for the lawyers. And that's exactly when you have a big internal market with lots of synergies, and then you divide it into 2 parts. It has collateral damages for everybody, and therefore I'm not a negotiator. I'm just a humble German Minister of the Economy. But if the United Kingdom would need more time to clarify its position, I would not mind. And I believe we should be patient in this regard. I'm deeply impressed by the seriousness of the struggle on how to deal with Brexit and how to deal with the situation in the UK Parliament. All the political parties, Labour, Tories, Lib Dem, they are all divided because every single member of Parliament is struggling how to overcome this odd situation. And if we can do it in a way that would limit the negative impact, the collateral damages, it would be worth doing. And the second point is, we have adopted, or not yet adopted, but the Commissioner for Trade, Malmström, has proposed a mandate for negotiations on a trade deal with the United States. This is something very spectacular, because normally it takes the European Union 3 to 4 years to draft such a mandate. And now it was possible in a little bit less than 1 year. And that indicates how much priority we are giving to this issue. How can we preserve the national, multilateral trade system? How can we reform WTO? And how can we avoid a trade war between US and China or between Europe and China? It would have a devastating effect. And we still can prevent it, but we have to work for it, and the European Union has to be ready to jump. That's, of course, one of the challenges.
I wasn't going to get to Brexit yet, but just while we're on the subject...
You mentioned in the beginning, sorry.
We're going to get there at some point.
You provoked me.
That was not provocation. I'll get that. But just on the subject, from the Commission's perspective at this stage, obviously Parliament is having a very serious argument about this, and there is still a possible that there is no deal that comes out of this. How would the Commission react, do you think, to that in terms of smoothing that process and making it, to Peter's point, as unpainful as possible for everybody?
Maybe first a word on growth in Europe. I concur with the analysis that we are still in a quite robust and solid position. We are going to deliver our own forecast in a few days on the 7th of February. But what we see is obviously that we have more and more risks. Some of the risks come from outside, and certainly trade tensions are the worst risks. Some are local, I would say, could come from the slowdown in the Chinese economy, and some also come from Europe. And there, of course, the situation of the UK, the Brexit, and also, I would say, the political context certainly is at play. And the European elections are going to be absolutely decisive for the future of Europe. They are probably the most important we ever had, the more risky, and maybe if some choices are made, the more dangerous we ever had. So let's keep being confident in Europe. I think we've got a huge asset there. I think that we need to reinforce potential growth, certainly, to work on this. We never had so many people employed in job ever in Europe, or unemployment is decreasing. But, well, we know where we are, and we must be conscious of the risk. Christine Lagarde used to say we need to repair the house when the roof when the sun is shining. We can see some clouds and even maybe some drops here or there, and that's what we need absolutely to take care of. Then on Brexit, what happened 2 weeks ago is absolutely decisive, because the 2 votes that intervene in the British Parliament tell us clearly what the British Parliament doesn't want. They don't want at this stage the deal we've negotiated. We might regret that, but I think it was the best deal possible under the constraint that they had and we had to save also the internal market. But it was a massive rejection of that deal at this stage. Then the second day there was a vote of confidence or the rejection of a non-confidence vote for Madame May. And this has a very precise signification. That means that they also don't want a no deal. So they don't want that deal, they don't want a no deal. What are we waiting for? We're waiting for them not only to tell us what they don't want, but what they want. And there I've got not a nuance, but maybe something to add to what Peter said about clarification.
Sorry, but just what happens if they can't give you that?
I'm moving
You'll
to
get
that.
to that, okay.
We need some clarity, even to give them some time to clarify. I will explain. You know that to ask, for example, for an extension, you need 2 things. You need to have unanimity among the 27, and I'm not worried that it will be there. It's there since the beginning. And you also need a kind of reasoned request. You cannot just say, well, it's the 28th of March, we're not yet there, give us some time. You must clarify some options. So I think we must not know precisely what is the way forward. Obviously, it's not ready, but we need to have a clarity in options. This option is now more on the table. This option is no more on the table. Let's say, for example, this deal and no deal. What are the other options? And then, if this is the case, maybe some time can be requested. But I think for the time being, the ball is not in Brussels. The ball is mostly in London. And we are waiting for the British government, the British Parliament, I would say, to know better what the options are, to choose between that. There are so many contradictions in the British politics. They need to be at least a bit reduced so that we can move forward. And of course, the door of the Commission and the door of each and every member state is certainly open because, you know, we never wanted Brexit. I think, just like Peter, that we are much better with the EU, with UK in, and that the UK is much stronger inside the EU. We are in a global world, and we need to have those big regional alliances, and we share so much. Sure. We are the place with a cultural, economic, social model which is unique. We are, until now, all defending liberal democracy. And we need to have the UK in. But of course, it is up to them to choose to stay. Not up to us to tell them, okay. But if, of course, we can move against the no deal, well, that's the best case scenario. And we are, of course, ready to consider that.
I don't want to go too far into Brexit, but just can I do a very quick round of this and just say, you know, if you look at where we sit today, just very quickly, what is your projection of where this ends up on the 29th?
Peter is not a negotiator, I'm not a negotiator, but the Commission is negotiating, so I must be very careful about my words. I can say what I hope. I hope that on the 29th of March we will still be in a move that authorizes eventually the UK to stay in the EU.
So you still hold that hope that'll happen?
I think
Okay.
I think this I hope that this possibility is still open on the 29th of March. It opens various.
Quick answer: do you think there's still a chance that the UK will stay? Because I asked this question in a session last year, and the answer was an emphatic no way. So obviously that's a big change.
I think there is a chance, and I actually have a proposal of how this, how the whole mess could be resolved on the side of the UK.
Okay.
If you think that the problem right now is that there are three options. It's actually not two, it's three options, you know. Theresa May's or something similar to what she's proposing, and which is the deal. There is a no deal crashing out, and then there is the stay. The problem with three options is that, you know, how do you deal with that if you had, for instance, went back to the people and asked them, what do you ask them? So there is a mechanism actually how to deal with such a situation where you can express your preferences in a way that is fair and can be aggregated. And it's called a single transferable vote.
Yep.
And that would have the following structure. You ask people, what is your first preferred, and second, what is your second preferred option between those three? Then, you know, you eliminate the one that got the least number of votes, and you're left with two. And that this mechanism takes into account second preferences and could actually be a way of eliminating what is right now seems to be the default option.
But why not starting with eliminating the no deal?
Because there is a sufficient amount of people in the UK Parliament that actually want this. And right now it is the default.
But I think this is the big question that we're not great at referenda. We don't have good experience of this, and I think we found it challenging.
You know, I'm Swiss. I have a lot of experience with referenda and initiatives and how to deal with them. I mean, social aggregation of preferences is something that you have to.
That's right. So your view is there's still a chance that this happens in the UK?
I think there should be intelligent solutions.
Okay. We are not advising our friends in the UK, but I can see on mathematical options only two. So at the present, one is to use the remaining time schedule to find still an agreement on the present deal. My impression is that it is unlikely that this deal, even if if clarified or explained in some extent, would get a majority in the British Parliament. And the second one would be to avoid a no-deal Brexit, to extend the deadlines, and that would be, of course, a second best option. But I cannot see a majority for staying in the customs union for Norway Plus. I see no majority for hard Brexit. I see no majority yet for a second referendum. So this is all under debate, and it is changing every day. For example, today I was carefully listening to the debate, and I see that for example, some of the ministers in government say, well, we are loyal to the Prime Minister, of course, and we back her policy, but we want to avoid at any cost a no-deal scenario. So this is a painful exercise for all our British friends, and therefore we have to wait, and this is where I agree with Pierre, we have to wait what they ask from us, and then we have to consider it in a constructive attitude. And if they would ask extension of Article 50 without really knowing at 100% what they would decide 2 or 3 weeks or months later, then it is something that we would have to consider. I cannot speak on behalf of the Commission, I cannot speak on behalf of all 27, but it's a serious moment, and that requires a lot of responsibility and mutual understanding.
Okay, Gillian. As a business person who runs a highly successful international business out of the Netherlands, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I mean, as a company, the first thing we think about is our employees, because we have 3,000 people located in the UK, and we have many British people that are working in other places in the world. I think the uncertainty, that's probably the worst that I see also with our employees. Yeah, we hope, of course, for a good outcome, also because we are, of course, in tourism. And the UK from a customer base, but also we bring a lot of customers to the UK. So, yeah, I always think that the connection with the UK to the EU is extremely important. So I hope in some way or form that will remain. But I'm not so experienced as to how that can be.
And finally, Giovanni, do you think there's any chance that Britain stays at this point?
On the issue of Brexit, I think that Pierre described well how to manage the negotiation. He's a good negotiator. I have some experience on that.
You've been on the wrong side of it, have you?
Personal experience on that.
Yeah.
Then in any case, I think that we have to be flexible and then negotiate. This is what I learned. And just because we have to avoid the no-deal scenario.
Sure. Okay.
This, okay.
So I think we'll leave that for the moment, if that's okay. But just going to Gillian quickly on the economy, one of the things that, as you look at the world, at the big blocks around the world, you've got the US and China that have been quite dynamic economically, but also particularly dynamic on technology, on the next generation of what's going to drive business and the economy. Europe has struggled more on this. From where you sit, running a very successful internet company, what do you think Europe needs to do in order to change that and to actually create the environment to make that happen? You've got some people here who can probably make some difference. So just what are the 2 or 3 things that would make a difference?
Yeah, and I agree to lots of things that have been said, that a lot of success has been built in Europe, and you see we have many thriving economies. I do think that the one thing that needs a lot of attention is basically to maintain and to grow in the digital area. And I think for that we need, one, ideas. Second, we need speed, and we need scale. I think on ideas, you see already that Europe is a great foundation, right? It's very diverse, a lot of entrepreneurial people. So you see also that even the startup ecosystems are growing. So, and that is actually a very positive development that we've seen improving over time. If you think about scale, I think that's where we're lacking behind. And that sits in a few areas, I think. If you think about funding for really companies that are scaling, you see in other parts of the world, they're so far ahead as to what we're doing in Europe. I've looked at the investments that even pension funds are doing in Europe. 0.7% goes into these growth businesses, which is capital we have available. So that needs a serious attention, because we need to grow more companies like Booking. And the other part, which is also something that Booking is facing, is the regulatory framework, which, if you think about, Europe has 500 million customers. It's probably the biggest market in the world. And I think we're underutilizing that, because if everybody needs to work for their own customer base in their countries, then we'll never be able to compete with the US or China. So I think we need to really think how we can make it easier, and not every 300 kilometers have a different law, a different regulation, a different standards that companies have to deal with. We need companies to be able to focus on how do we reach these customers, instead of focusing on understanding the regulatory framework in Europe. So that really, really needs attention. And so that's for the scaling part, I think, and the speed as well ties down to the investments, I think.
Peter, you put your hand up. You wanted to interject there, but just one of the things that is interesting is this desire to have more ability to operate across borders without differences and challenges. But at the same time, we're seeing a pushback from populations about more harmonisation in Europe. So how do you think about that?
Well, first of all, that's an important point, but I raised my hands for what Gillian said about capital, venture capital available. We have seen so many excellent startups in Europe. We have a very good environment for financing the first two phases of growth. And then when the startup is looking for more money, 70, 100, 150 million, they will never find the money in Europe. They will find it in the US. US-led venture capital funds, by the way, spending not only American private money, but also Arab money, also European money, because there are a lot of European institutional investors giving the money to American funds. And that means that all the successful companies are growing slowly but steadily towards an American citizenship. And we have seen it many times. And now I have three excellent companies in Germany. One is Celonis, AI using for analysis of business models, unicorn, €1 billion worth. They were in need of money. They found the money in the US. There is number 26. This is a banking system with your smartphone. They were in need of $250 million dollar. They found the money in the US. And there is DeepL. This is a young startup providing machine learning translation for the bigger languages, perhaps the best in the world. And they were in need of more money, and they found it in the US. So the question is, what can we do to trigger to trigger venture capital funds in Europe, that we can not protect, but encourage and strengthen our startups. Second point is, I also agree that we have to strengthen and to use the power of this very big and strong market of 500 million people still, a little bit less after Brexit, if it comes to Brexit. But then the question is, how can we use our regulatory framework to become more competitive and not less? The entire debate was centered last year on proposals on how to deal with bad weather situations, how to provide more solidarity, how to provide more relief for budgets of member states. This is a debate where Germany took part in because we want to have a European consensus. But the question is, what are the regulatory disadvantages in Europe in order to attract new investment, in order to attract innovative companies? For example, when it comes to access to data, we are so proud about this Datenschutzgrundverordnung, what is it, data protection basic regulation. But we have still not answered a lot of questions as who has the right of access to data that are so badly needed to train algorithms and artificial intelligence. We have a situation that in the US, 10 times more money is invested in AI research and development, and it is invested not by the state, it is invested by the big internet platforms. And these big internet platforms have enormous amounts of data available, and that means they have the money and they have the data.
Sure.
And the question is, are we ready to compete? Are we still hungry? And if so, then we have to take the necessary steps.
So what steps, you wanted to interject a bit, I mean, what is the ability of Europe now to continue harmonization at a time when politics are very, very challenging, as you've said? There's a lot of pushback against reforms in France. There's a big populist change against the traditional order in most countries. We're going to have these elections in May that could have quite an interesting impact in Parliament. If this is needed to create that dynamism, how able is Europe to continue to push this agenda of harmonization, be it fiscally or in regulation and other things?
Better told about what we have tried to do and what we are trying to do to combat the scenario of bad weather. And on the other hand, what we must do to reinforce our growth and potential growth. And I think that we must act on both of these parts of public policies. On the, I would say, defensive part, obviously, we need to continue monitoring our public finances in a way, with dialogue, that authorizes growth, but also respects rules. Because it's highly important that public debt is under control in Europe. I think that the rise of public debt is a threat for our economy, and we must absolutely go on reducing that, meaning everywhere. Second, if you look at the next crisis, I think we are in a better shape because we have established something which is not spectacular but indispensable, which is banking union. We need to complete the banking union. And third, I think that we still need more deepening in our Eurozone, that we have a Eurozone which is a fantastic asset for stability, but we also need to have a complete, symmetric, with tools that have been, for example, addressed in the Franco-German agreement in Meseberg to create a limited but significant Eurozone budget incorporated in the EU budget. I mean, this is to have solidity, to avoid further crisis. But of course, we also need to be offensive. And there I will join you on 2 points. The first one is investment. We still have an investment gap in Europe compared to our most important partners. And this gap might become more and more important if the slowdown in investment goes down. And this is why in our next budget, but also in all our budgets all over Europe, we must give the priority to investment. This is investing in the future. This is about R&D. This is about developing tools such as what we call the Juncker Plan, which will be transformed into InvestEU, and focusing especially, as you said, on internet, on IA, etc. And last,
this has been talked about for a long time. I mean, is it the sort of thing that, I mean, is
this is done. If you look at, for example, the Juncker Plan, it did not exist in 2014, and we established a plan which authorized the financing of over 330 billion euros extra investment, which wouldn't have probably found financing. I don't mean that all of them wouldn't have been implemented, but it helped a lot. And we need to modernize that and to concentrate it, to have new targets and wider targets. And finally, the single market issue is absolutely crucial because we've got too many regulations, because we still have split markets, and that's absurd in the sectors of the economy of tomorrow. Our economy, I met somebody here, I won't mention him, but told him one of our problems, our weaknesses and strengths, is that our economies are export-driven, and this is first for Germany, which has here an enormous advantage. But we must also focus on our internal market. This is a solid, robust, long-lasting
Let's follow up
asset.
on one quick thing.
And for that, we need to have a regulatory
And then I'll
approach.
pass to Giovanni, but just quickly, you talked about being robust in another downturn. I mean, people have said, you know, we're 7 or 8 years into an upturn. Interest rates are still negative, even at this point. and you have shown in the Commission a willingness to push back on people who want to raise their deficits. If we do go into a downturn, what is the ammunition, what are the weapons that can be used to fight that, given that there isn't a huge amount of monetary policy room for manoeuvre at this point, and the deficits, and we're already having battles around deficits in certain countries. So where's the ammunition if that happens?
That's why
or will you be willing to be more
That's
flexible?
why I said we're not at the end of the road.
I understand, but
in our policy mix, this is true for public deficits. This is true for reducing debt. This is also probably true, but I'm not a central banker, for what concerns monetary policy. Even if now we are getting out of QE, it's quite likely that for a time being, we will have still an accommodative monetary policy, because inflation is not that high and because growth is not that spectacular. And so I trust the ECB to have.
No, but this isn't about
guidance.
the ECB. Would you have a willingness to be more flexible on that, do you think, on deficits in that environment?
You must have asked this question to Peter. Some find us even too flexible. I think that, well, the right way is to reduce deficits without damaging growth. That's what we try to do. And in other contexts, things might be with a bit different results. But still, I think that the rules have to be applied because they're not absurd. Those rules serve, finally, the purpose to avoid public debt to explode. If I look at the comparison between before the last crisis, we are much stronger in protecting the banking sector. We've got new rules, we've got banking union, etc. But we've got much more public debt, and this is weakness.
So, and Italy is obviously big on public debt.
I was not.
No, I know you're not. I'm not. I'm just. But I mean,
alluding.
I'm sure you weren't. But in Italy, where there's been a change of government, there is a populist government, a coalition that is relatively robust at the moment. Can you just talk through why that's happened in Italy? Can you talk through what people want? We've talked a lot about what people don't want at the moment, but what do the Italian people want from that coalition when it comes to Europe?
On this coalition, maybe they can. To answer to this question, I want to start from the previous question, which is important, because Italy is not a specific case. It's a part of Europe, and we have the same risks of Europe in the future. The problem is the international competition. If you think in a strategic way, in the long run, we see the problem of the shift of the economic weight from Western countries, from USA to Asia to China. This is the long-run perspective, and this is inevitable for demographic reasons and other reasons. In this scenario, we see the specific competition for the future technological hegemony between USA and China. In this competition, Europe simply is not on the stage. It doesn't exist. We are speaking about competition mainly, and the problems are the competition mainly, regulations, etc., between countries, between European countries. Why we don't have the scale? Because there is more competition between European countries than the competition in the world. Of course, Germany has a big is competitive with a big surplus, but this is another problem. This means that we need to act as a Europe,
So
to concentrate resources in big program of investment, in technology, innovation, in investment. This is for growth and also for innovation and competition. It is quite impossible in Europe just to talk about Euro budget. We can't use the word stabilization because it's a bad word in our discussion.
Okay.
It's strange. Then
So you're saying this is a government thing that needs to be done? I'm
No,
confused.
the problem the problem is if we can't do that, of course, there is a problem between the single country and the rules of Europe, because we have to think at a national level at this big problem. We have to change the model in Europe. We are following the best results is maybe Germany and some other countries. Also Italy is following a wrong model. This is the export-led model. We can keep in a permanent way this model because it's against the logic. Then we have invest more,
Okay.
etc. Then, if this is the situation, we have to think about that. We have to immediately to change. I want to say that we are discussing Europe. Even now, I agree with Pierre when he talk about investment. We have a gap in investment.
Okay.
But talking about the rules, etc. It's okay. We need rules. But we are focusing just on how we have to be together,
Okay.
the rules. But we have to focus more on why we have to be together. And why is the problem of the scale and to be on the stage in international competition.
Okay. We're going to go to questions in 1 second, because obviously the point of this room is to foster a debate in the room, so I will go to that. But just very quickly, Peter, just final thought on trust. Around Europe, there seems to be a deficit of trust around the ability and the willingness of those running countries and other institutions to give people what they need in their lives, whether it's inequality, unemployment, other things. There's a pushback that's happening in some form. Is that a short-term thing? Is that something that will pass? What is your sort of diagnosis of this?
Well, I agree that it is around in Europe, but it is also outside.
It's a global thing, sure.
It's a global phenomenon, and dealing with this, I wouldn't say that it's just a deficit in trust, but it is also a misleading of public opinion by populist approaches. Both phenomena are interacting, and the question is, would we be able to overcome it? I was quite optimistic when we have seen the last parliament election in the Netherlands, and then the presidential election and the parliament election in France 2 years ago. But today, the big challenge in my eyes for Europe is the next European Parliament election. And the question, can we contain populism? Can we contain extreme left-wing or right-wing parties from gaining more influence? Will there be a solidarity, a kind of consensus amongst the parties in the political center? This is one of the biggest challenges of them all, and we have seen it in the US, we have seen it in Latin and Southern American countries, we have seen it even in Eastern European countries. So this is something that will decide.
But do you think, as we speak,
on the performance of the European political model in the future? Yes, of course.
And so you wanted to, just very quickly, then we'll go to questions, but you have to...
I want to add that. Look, I go with President Juncker to the G20. And you must look at the table of G20. You've got Trump, you've got Xi Jinping, you've got Putin. Now you will have Bolsonaro, also he's invited in Davos. You've got the Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mr. Modi, etc. And on the other side, they are not all, I would say, liberal Democrats. You've got the Europeans. You've got Madame May. You've got Chancellor Merkel. You've got Prime Minister of Italy, President of the Council. You've got the President of France. You've got the European Union, plus Canada and plus Australia. This is also about value. And this is why I fully share the view that these elections are absolutely decisive, and that those who are not necessarily in the center, but truly pro-European, must create, after these elections, after a good campaign, a kind of new consensus for a new Europe.
And a new vision.
Absolutely.
Right. Do you have anything to add quickly before we go to questions, Gillian?
Yeah, I think if you think about trust in the digital area, I think we really need to think about leadership, right? And to make sure, because often you see what happens is that we talk about how we're being disrupted. I think it's time we start talking about the opportunities that digital opportunities bring. And I think that's also a job that companies, the politics, everybody needs to step up and make sure that we communicate so people actually have much more trust. And I think trust also is something, if you think about technology, that people feel they're going to be left behind. And for me, a critical point as well is talent for the future in digital jobs, right? Because you see, if in 2021, I think we'll have 760,000 jobs open in Europe. So we need to start thinking today how we're going to make sure that we have the right universities for the skills we need. How do we make sure we retrain? I think Canada made a great example as what they've done to really retrain lots of people. I think they spent 1 billion in doing it. So very successful. So there's many initiatives that need to be picked up today, so people actually don't feel they're going to be left behind, and they're actually an opportunity for them to have jobs when these digital, every company will eventually become a digital business in the future.
Brilliant.
Well, sorry.
No, very quickly. I just want to give the chance to the...
Oh, sure.
To the audience.
Just, on this trust and leadership question, I think it's very commendable that, Davos is trying to make, the WEF is trying to make a big effort to actually push European leaders to, think about what could be the positive role and what are the value bases. And, it's so easy to be gloomy about Europe and about the euro area. And, I don't have to channel my colleague Nouriel Roubini and all the others who sort of, have always predicted that it will fall apart. But it's so difficult, and I think it's a challenge to everybody in the room here and, of course, outside the room to, come up with the elevator speech with your positive vision on Europe. And I think everybody should actually think about this. Most politicians, especially when they're speaking to their national audiences, are so much better at the other side.
Right. So they're good at saying what they don't like, but not what they do like.
Everything
that
wrong,
seems to be a pretty consistent theme. Are there any questions that people have here in the audience? Here, and then we'll come to you afterwards. This gentleman in the front.
Since there was a mention of investment, of course, private sector investment must be like 10 times as large as public sector. But if I look at public sector investment in the euro area on average, and this is for you, Minister, it's really stuck at the same level as when QE started, 2.7% of euro area GDP, which is 1 full percentage point below Switzerland, since we are here, 1 full percentage point below Japan, and I think 0.7% below the US. So clearly there is a dearth of public sector investment, which is difficult to understand, because if you look at negative rates, some countries manage to finance themselves to be paid to borrow even at 7 years maturity. So one can hardly think politicians cannot imagine investment with zero return that pays for itself. Do you have any arguments to that?
Well, as far as the public investment is concerned, I mean, you have to make a clear distinction between investment in research and development. And as far as research and development is concerned, we have almost doubled the investment made by the German state over the last 15 years. And this is due to the fact that we have now sound public finances and we can simply afford it. We have the overall investment in research and development was increased to 3%. We are now going to increase it to 3.5 until 2025. We have also increased our general level of investment by the latest coalition agreement. That means we will invest in public infrastructure. That is important. I'm not saying that we have already resolved all the problems we are coping with. For example, what I cannot understand is that one of our big telecommunication companies, Deutsche Telekom, is involved in the Dutch mobile grid, and it's the best in the world, or at least the best in Europe. They have also taken part in the German mobile communications net grid, and we are much behind the Dutch quality and reliability. So this is something we have to discuss and to resolve. But I would say that the level of public investment depends, of course, on your margin of maneuver. Of course, when you have accumulated an enormous amount of sovereign debt, then it is quite difficult to convince the European Commission that they should allow more debt in order to increase the level of public investment.
Okay, can we go to the gentleman in the back here?
I'm sorry, my name is John Neal. I'm chairman of the Unipar Group. I'm from the UK. So my question, as you can imagine, is about Brexit. Some members of Parliament argue that a further vote would be an affront to democracy. But the situation we're in is because, allegedly, of the will of a third of the people who voted. The most reliable opinion poll over the last 2 years has been the YouGov poll. And the latest evidence from that poll is that by a majority of 12%, the will of all of the people is to remain in the EU. So would a further vote be an affront to democracy or the proper role of a democratic society?
Who would like to take that?
I take that because I come from a country which has some experience about referendums, not as much as Switzerland, and we don't want to have more, and we need to be very careful about that. But, well, not respecting the will of the people in a referendum is a mistake. If I look at the way we welcomed or accepted the Brexit vote, we regretted that, but we had to respect the Brexit, and we work on Brexit. And if there is an agreement, it's an agreement for an orderly Brexit, and we will have to accept that. So, I mean, it's fully legitimate to have a second vote if it comes from the will of the British people themselves. And this is why we, from the EU, we must not push for that. We might have some opinion, but it's up to the Brits to decide. But no, if after 3 years of discussion, you come to a point where you don't have any solution which is clear, and the only way to get out of the mess is to consult the people in a referendum, why not? And what is a mistake is when the EU almost imposed a second referendum. It happened, for example,
sure.
in Ireland a few years ago, and this was really criticized. We must make no pressure, but of course, if the UK wants a new referendum, welcome. It's up to them to decide.
Can I just ask one thing, actually, and we will go back to questions, is if there were an extension of Article 50, and there are the elections coming up, there will be a change of commission, other things coming through in the coming months, would that impact how that negotiation went? I.e., if you had a 6-month extension, let's say, would you find a different negotiator had a different perspective?
It depends on how long is the extension
sure.
and what for. And one point which is not neglectable, if the extension happens and if it's long, you will have MEPs elected in the UK.
Yep.
You will have elections, and then you will have MEPs, and then you will have commissioner, you will have institutions with UK in.
Yep. Yep.
And this is not an aspect that should be neglected, and it can also change the course of our common life. But well, that's not the most important point. Well, the length of the extension is certainly a key if this comes to a play. But again, whoever is in the Commission, whoever is a negotiator, I think, first of all, we need to be close to the will of the British people, close to the will of the British Parliament, close to the will of the British government, respect them, and be ready to accept this will.
Okay. Anyone behind me? In front. There you go, please.
Thanks. I'm Tonia Mastroboni, La Repubblica. One of the greatest questions for the future will be the role of the antitrust, the European antitrust. And there is a big question now what Ms. Vestager will decide on Alstom Siemens, of course, of this big French-German project. And you too, I mean, Mr. Altmaier and Mr. Moscovici were very explicit about the fact that we have to create European champions, no? So we have maybe to change the the power of antitrust and to do this, but this is my first question. And is this not a little bit a contradiction with what you did on, for example, Fincantieri and SDX? It is a Italo-French operation where Germany and France appealed to the European Commission to say, we can't do this, this is too big. So how can you harmonize these two positions? And what should the antitrust be in future in Europe? Thank you.
Sometimes you have a different look on things when the company concerned is vested in your country or elsewhere. And this is exactly describing the scope of the problem, because you've normally a company in one country, and then you have 27 or 26 countries where this is not the case. I believe in the need for I'm a true believer in market economy, but at the same time I believe in the need of a European industrial strategy, because we have to see and to make sure that that we stay competitive, that we be part of this innovation growth, and in order to compete and in order to succeed, we need national and European champions. And now there is one contradiction that cannot be resolved by just by words or by declarations. That is that if you want to have a truly big European champion, then it means you are more competitive on a global scale, but you have perhaps a little bit less competition inside the European Union internally. That is the logical consequence of it. For example, when talking about the Siemens Alstom, I'm not interfering with Margaret's competences in public, and I'm not interfering at all because it is it is a legally protected area. But talking about Turkey, for example, Turkey is going to organize a call for tender for the Turkish railway system amounting to 30 billion euro. And it means if you want to compete in such a call for tender, then you have to be big enough, strong enough to digest such a big project. And it's the same in other countries worldwide. So we have to discuss it. We have to distinguish between the current pending cases on the one side, to be decided according to the existing legislation in this field. And the second point is how to develop it organically with a view to new challenges on a global level.
You wanted to quickly...
Yeah, because I fully agree with what Peter said. Yes, we need to have European champions. And I think that it would be much better if this merger was authorized. But for that, we may think about the future. We need to take into account the new way the world economy is functioning, the role of China especially. But this decision has to be taken by the existing rules. And there, I must say that I have full trust in what Margaret Vestager proposes, because she's not acting from ideology, neither the ideology to say we absolutely needed to do that or we don't need to do that, but through pragmatism. And so the question in the coming days, because it's a question of days, is how can we at the same time have this merger, create that European champion, and respect the rules? And of course, for that, we need no interference. We need some trust.
So let's have one very, very quick last question, if there is one. We are down to 1 minute. Is there anything in the back here? Okay, I'm just going to ask one final question of the audience, and I want just a one-word answer, if you can, if we're just going to run around quickly. Is there any way, some people have said that the UK, having the UK in the EU is a bit like driving with a handbrake on. Is there any way that the departure of the EU actually, on a 10-year view, strengthens the remaining entity of the EU? Can you just have a quick one-word answer to that?
I believe that we're better with the UK in. If finally the UK is out, we need to be even stronger and to have a new project altogether.
Is there any way it helps over a 10-year view to have that ability to integrate more?
It all depends if Europe comes together even more, because that is the one thing that actually the Brexit has achieved, is really to unite 27. So if that unity somehow also covers sort of spills over into meaningful actions, then yes.
Any upside, Peter, for you?
On the long run, I can also imagine positive effects. On the short and medium-term perspective, I'm afraid that both sides will suffer, but we are a European Union of sovereign nation states, and it's up to the UK to decide its future.
Yeah, like
Any
I said, as a business, we hope for the right outcome.
Any upside that you see in terms of pulling people together?
Yes, we lose something in UK and in Europe. We lose also a kind of liberal in the country, and there is a kind of divergent ideas among the other countries that we lose a lot. I think also from this point of view.
Okay, so it's a loss. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to the panel.